Okay, team. So this is one of my really kind of favorite topics to talk about is the transition of life from water onto land. And we're first going to talk about how this all worked in plants and fungi, and we'll talk about how this happened in animals later. But really, this was one of the major steps in life, in the evolution of life on our planet, because oceans are big, but there's a whole lot of land out there to live on as well, right? So how and why did life get on there? How and why did life move on to land? That's what we're going to talk about in this quick little intro. So about 500 million years ago, this happened to our time machine, right? Not too long after the first eukaryotic cells came about. Really, if that happened about, 1.8 to 1.2 billion years ago, 500 million years is not that long ago, okay? But at this point in time, Earth's land was basically void of life, right? We can kind of think of Earth's land at this point in time kind of like new islands that are forming in the ocean, right? Nothing's on there. Might be some sand that's formed through the process of erosion and things like that, right? But it's void of life, okay? But the oceans are full of life at this point in time, about 500 million years ago. They are chock full of life. It's getting a little crowded and busy in the oceans. And 700 million years ago, most of the major lineages of animals had evolved, right? But nobody was on land. Plants, animals, fungi, nobody was on land 500 million years ago. Okay, so lots of stuff going on in the waters. Plants, well, not plants yet, but algae, there were some fungi living in the water, lots of animals living in the water, right? But not so much on land. So why move on to land? What's going on, right? So some of the benefits of life on land, there's just more space, right? If you're the first one to live there, there's no competition. You can have the entire land to yourself, right? The other main advantage to living on land is that there's no predators, right? There's something to eat you. If there's nobody else on land, you're totally free to kind of do what you want. There's no risk of somebody else eating you, right? If you're in a plant, or if you're something that photosynthesizes rather, there's a lot more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere on land than there is in the water, right? There's a higher concentration of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is one of those things that's really necessary for photosynthesis, right? You can't go through photosynthesis without carbon dioxide. And that soil, if you can get to it, it's full of minerals and nutrients, okay? That's the kind of tricky part that we'll talk about a little bit later. How do you get to it, okay? So there's some advantages. Mainly, one of the big ones was just no competition, right? Because the oceans are really busy right now, about 500 million years ago. Land, whole new territory, nothing going on there, okay? So less competition and more carbon dioxide. That was the big one for plants, is that there was a greater concentration of carbon dioxide on land. But it's not all fun and games, right? There's some major challenges to living on land too. A few of them being things like scarcity of water, right? You don't always have access to water like you do in the oceans, which is really important because water is one of the key ingredients to photosynthesis, right? Organisms that photosynthesize need water in order to carry that out. So you also run the risk of desiccation, drying out if there's not water around. Just makes life kind of hard if you're dried out, right? You also have to fight against gravity when you're on land, right? How do you stand upright? How do you get access to that sunlight? How do you keep yourself up off the ground, right? That is not so much of a problem when you're living in water because the water kind of holds you up and moves you around, right? And speaking of moving around, how do you get your gametes together, right? Reproduction on land, probably pretty challenging for those first organisms, right? If you live in water, you can just poof your gametes out into the water, they float around, currents carry them around, and then they find each other, right? That isn't atmosphere is not as viscous as water, right? So it's harder to move things around, especially gametes when we think about reproduction. It's harder to do that on land than it is in water. And UV radiation. Right? We talked about UV radiation in terms of prokaryotes and how it causes mutations, which may or may not be a good thing, you could argue. But regardless, for these organisms moving on land, there's a more intense UV radiation on land than there is in water. Water causes the attenuation of a lot of sunlight and a lot of UV radiation in general. Okay, so kind of some pros and cons, and we'll talk about how both fungi and plants faced these different challenges of life on land during this week's material. I just love this stuff. So much fun.